Mollie here, and I'm very happy to tell you today the old man and I are going to talk about a show we actually enjoyed. Here's an oldie, but as far as we're concerned, a goodie. Today we are going to talk about The Adventures of Brisco County Jr. The show was created by Jeffrey Boehm and Carlton Cuse. The pilot, which was nearly 1.5 hours long, was written by David Simpkins, and the show premiered August 27th, 1993, a Friday. The stars were Bruce Campbell as Brisco County Jr., Julius Carey as Lord Bowler, Billy Drago as the antagonist John Bly, and John Aston as Professor Wickwire. The show was filmed in the same area as Blazing Saddles, Maverick, and other wonderful shows and movies at a place called Laramie Street, which was torn down shortly after The Adventures of Brisco County Jr. ended, largely because it was determined that office space and a suburban setting were more valuable than a lot where one would film westerns. The series was set in the American Old West, specifically in 1893, largely taking place in San Francisco and the Southwest, with occasional forays into Mexico. So is this show a western? Well, the answer is yes and no. The creators of the show were upfront about historical accuracy not being a priority. If you're a stickler for historical accuracy, this is not the show for you. However, if you're looking for a blend of the Old West and science fiction, this could very well be the show that you enjoy the most. The premise of the show is pretty straightforward. Brisco County Jr. is a Harvard-educated lawyer who decides to become a bounty hunter, after realizing he doesn't want to waste his life being bored in a courtroom. He's also looking for the coming thing, which leads to a friendship with Professor Wickwire, played by John Aston. This is where a lot of the science fiction elements come in, starting with the professor building a rocket in the very first episode. The first 20 episodes deal with Brisco hunting down the men responsible for the murder of his father, Federal Marshal Brisco County Sr. The leader of this gang is an outlaw by the name of John Bly, played by Billy Drago. The secondary conflict between Brisco County Jr. and John Bly is that both men are seeking a mysterious orb that is rumored to bestow superhuman strength, which Brisco discovers to be true by the end of the first episode. The show is a serial and episodic. Episodes 1 through 20 tell the story of Brisco hunting down John Bly and Bly's gang, and the pursuit of the mysterious orb. Each episode also has its own self-contained story, but episodes 21 through 26 are outside the main arc, and seem to be the result of meddling that wanted the show to be a western with the science fiction stripped out. To me, this also stripped out a lot of what made the show unique, given that the show aired on Fox on Friday, right before The X-Files. It probably would have made more sense to lean into the science fiction rather than moving it away. The role of Brisco County Jr. was played by Bruce Campbell, who is probably best known for playing Ash in the Evil Dead franchise. And Campbell brought the same charisma to Brisco County Jr. that he brought to the Evil Dead. The character of Brisco County Jr. is wisecracking and clever, and there's great chemistry between Campbell and his co-stars, the most entertaining relationship being Brisco County's rivalry, then friendship with a fellow bounty hunter who went by the name Lord Bowler, played by the late Julius Carey. The other important characters to remember were Socrates Poole, the lawyer who acted as an intermediary between Brisco and his robber baron employers. Socrates Poole was played by Christian Clemenson. Last but not least was Dixie Cousins, played by Kelly Rutherford. She and Brisco had a will they or won't they relationship throughout the season. Rutherford did an excellent job channeling her inner Mae West into saloon singer Dixie. I also want to give an honorable mention to Brisco's horse Comet. Comet was actually played by several specialized horses, and the horse selected for a particular scene depended on what the scene required. But more often than not, no matter which horse was on screen, Comet stole the show. The men responsible for creating the show, Jeffrey Boehm and Carlton Cuse, and the writer of the pilot, David Simpkins, created something that hadn't really been seen in Hollywood before, at least not in this era. The late Jeffrey Boehm was a writer on such films as The Lost Boys, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Lethal Weapon 2, and Lethal Weapon 3. Carlton Cuse was an executive producer and joint showrunner on the television series Lost, and was showrunner, executive producer, developer, and writer of the Netflix series Lock and Key. It's also interesting to note that Cuse was a junior at Harvard studying American history when he organized a test screening for the movie Airplane, which got him thinking about a career in film. David Simkins has written for a lot of shows I've enjoyed over the years, including Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, the 1999 Charmed, Dark Angel, The Dresden Files, Warehouse 13, Human Target, and Grimm. He also wrote the 1987 film Adventures in Babysitting. Given the other work these men have done, it makes total sense that I would enjoy The Adventures of Brisco County Jr. For me, the show was a wonderful blend of the Old West, science fiction, humor, and drama. In a lot of ways, it also reminds me of shows that would come after, like Firefly and The Orville. If this sounds appealing to you, you can catch The Adventures of Brisco County Jr. for purchase on Amazon, currently $1.99 per episode, or $26.99 for the season, which is the entire series. It's also available on YouTube and Google Play for the same price, or you can get the DVDs from someplace like eBay for around $8. Or get it for free someplace else like your local library. Now, there are spoilers ahead, so if you don't want any spoilers for a show that first aired in 1993, stop here. However, if spoilers from a show that aired 31 years ago, if that doesn't matter to you, just keep on listening. The first spoiler that I'm going to talk about is Pistol Pete. Now, Pistol Pete is one of the members of John Bly's gang. And in the very first episode, Pete is definitely comic relief. And he worked out so well that even after he died in episode 1, he was brought back in subsequent episodes. One of the things you need to know about Pete is no one touches Pete's piece, which is his gun. In the very first episode, Brisco learns this the hard way when he touches Pete's piece, and Pete freaks out, and they end up in a gunfight in the middle of the street. Brisco brilliantly realizes that not only is he drawing pistols with Pete, but there are others concealed on either side of him who are going to shoot him as well. So all Brisco has to do is drop to the ground, and Pete and the other guys, they all shoot each other, and he takes out a good portion of the gang right there and then. But then they bring Pete back later with a flimsy explanation as to how he survived. And it's very amusing, Pete and his piece, throughout the season. And he's definitely one of the funnier things, and he's one of those villains that you actually kind of root for, but you hate him at the same time.
The thing with Pete is he kind of comes across like an educated man, and he works with morons. So he's always using complicated language when he's talking to these people. And then when he realizes things aren't going as he wants them to, he tends to get somewhat intellectually abusive when he's talking to people. So Pete is an interesting character. He's played for comic relief through the whole series, but I agree with you. He is a likable character. The running gag of he goes into some sort of OCD panic if you touch his six-shooter, and he gets all bent out of shape if that happens.
Oh, he is so high-strung. He's very neurotic. And yeah, it's definitely played for laughs in the show. And Brisco, he seems to really enjoy irritating Pete. So I think it's Pete's irritation that I find so humorous, because it makes him so human. And yeah, so Pistol Pete, he's definitely one of those characters that, man, I'm so glad they created him.
This series reminded me a little bit when it first aired of the 60s series with Robert Conrad, Wild Wild West. And in that series, it was combining westerns and like James Bond spy stuff. And there was a little bit of campiness there because it was in the 60s, the same time as Batman and the rest of them. So I think it was just trendy to kind of film it that way. So There was comedic elements, but I don't believe Wild Wild West was ever intended to be a comedy. It was meant to be a Western spy combination with a little bit of humor. Whereas The Adventures of Brisco County Jr., this is meant to be a comedy combining Western and science fiction. And I think the closest thing to it, maybe not in genre, but in feel, is the Orville. Because the Orville started out as a comedic science fiction Star Trek type takeoff. But inside of there was some good stuff once you got going with the series and they found the balance of comedy and science fiction. And for this series, which only lasted one season, so this is in the long line of Fox messing up television shows for one season, because this ran one season, Space Above and Beyond ran one season, Firefly ran one season. There's a list of these things where Fox just didn't know what to do with science fiction stories.
Fox also canceled the Orville, and it went over to Hulu after that. So yeah, I don't know why they can come up with these great shows, and then they just blow it. And I know that when I was doing the research, Simpkins had said that when he was preparing to write the pilot for Brisco County Jr., that he had been studying a lot of the old serials. So that's where a lot of this inspiration came from, was those older serials. And that he drew his inspiration from that, and he wanted to combine the Western stuff with the science fiction stuff because nobody'd really done it before. Again, like, I don't understand how Fox managed to screw this up so bad, but they did. Small-minded executives, they didn't understand what they were trying to do with the combination of the science fiction and the Old West. And they decided, well, they wanted it to be a Western for some reason, even though it aired right before the X-Files. Yeah. So that made no sense whatsoever, and they killed the show. The
story meddling was really apparent, because when they finished up, we'll call it the Orb arc, because I don't want to give any spoilers away, they basically turned Brisco County into kind of what the Wild Wild West was trying to be, where there was a spy element that was kind of, maybe not spy, but they were employees of the government, started a new storyline there, and it didn't interest me at all, and I can see why it got canceled, because that storyline wasn't going anywhere useful.
I think the thing is that I think, and I don't know this for certain, but this is just my suspicion, that perhaps the executives at Fox understood Wild Wild West because they'd probably watched it when they were kids, and they didn't understand what was currently popular, which sounds like a very familiar problem. Executives not understanding what the public actually wants. And these executives, they tend to not be creatives. They're business people. So, creativity, they don't get it. They just want to use some pattern from the past that was successful, and they think they can duplicate that for some reason, and they always screw it up.
I remember in the 90s, after the series was done, on the cable network TNT, and I don't remember which day it was a weekend, either Saturday morning or Sunday morning, they had Wild Wild West, and then they had The Adventures of Brisco County Jr. right after that. So even TNT was sandwiching these two things together. And there is similarity there. I'm not trying to say there's not, but what they did to The Adventures of Brisco County Jr., I can see why it was canceled. Because there was a blend there of, and I guess there should be a little bit of warnings to go out there. In 1993, there were some possibly looking at 2024, looking at this with that 2024 lens. There's some ethnic stereotypes they play up once in a while, and there is some humor that doesn't work, but then there's a lot of humor that does work, and then they lean into the historical inaccuracies when they're kind of looking at the camera and winking as they're introducing something that clearly must not have happened, but it's funny, so we go along with it. And that's the thing. The show has its tongue firmly planted in its cheek. So what you're getting is intentional misrepresentation of history, but done in a way that they know the audience is going to catch on to that, and we're all going to go along for a fun ride. So it's a farce, but it's done in a way that's intelligently done.
Yeah, that's what I was about to add, that it felt like we were being treated like intelligent people rather than having some dumbed down crap shoveled to us, kind of like now. So that was one of the nice things about Brisco County Jr. was that it treated us like mature adults, but it was still comedy. And it takes cleverness to be able to do that, but then you look at the filmography of the men who created the show, and you can see why it was actually really good.
The Professor Wickwire stuff, who was played by John Astin, people would know him from the 60s Addams Family. He played Gomez. And that introduced some science fiction elements, and I'm going to be careful here not to introduce spoilers, but the Orb storyline and even John Bly, there's a heavy science fiction element when you get going with the story. And I think that as the arc was unfolding in front of us, the story was getting better and better. And then when they kind of ended that arc 20 episodes in, it's like they didn't know what to do with the rest of the season. They should have probably just stopped the season there, because it kind of everything was brought to a conclusion. Because the series dealt with a few things, like Brisco and his late father. There was a history there of Brisco County Jr. not feeling like he measured up to his dad, because his dad was a legendary lawman in the West. You saw that in the pilot. You saw his dad bringing in the Bly gang, and then through a interesting set of things that caused them to escape, he was killed, and he was actually killed in a fairly brutal way. And then Brisco Jr. was determined to hunt down the killers of his father, and he got sucked into this whole orb thing, and then that's where the series kind of took these interesting turns. Because as you said, Molly, sometimes the episode would be like a standalone thing, but there'd usually be something in the episode that related back to the arc they were trying to do. And just so we're clear, this was 1993 on U.S. television over the air. So this was fairly unique. It wasn't quite arc-driven like a Babylon 5 or even a latter Deep Space Nine, but it was the beginnings of something going on there on Fox over-the-air television. So I think that should count for something, because that was an attempt at getting an arc going in a series. I think there's lots of interesting concepts in here that I think is worth watching if you're okay with that Orville type of humor, where one moment they're cracking jokes about something, and then it gets serious for a while, and the tone changes, and then it gets goofy again. And I kind of call that humor the Orville type humor, where when they do try to bring some gravitas to the story, it's difficult to pull that off, but I think this series does that well. And then they flip off into comedy, and they go back into serious stuff again.
Personally, I mean, I recognize that the men who wrote this show were not Generation X. However, I think what they captured there was the essence of how a lot of Gen Xers deal with reality, with life.
They were targeting Gen Xers with this. This was definitely targeted at that Gen X slacker generation.
Yeah, that very sarcastic way of looking at the world that, yeah, something serious is going to happen right in front of you, and you're going to make a joke about it. Because that's the way that Gen Xers deal with things. A lot of them, anyway. So I think that this show really captures the essence of 1993. So it's interesting as just a microcosm of what life was like at that point in time, when it's set in, 100 years before that. Yet it's the attitude of the time. And in the show, Brisco County Jr. was always looking for the next thing. He was never content with what was right in front of him. He always wanted to know what was coming next. A lot of that had to do with technology. And considering where things were in 1993, right when the internet was about to take off and cell phones were about to really take off, just the technology that we have today really came out of the 90s, at least the way that we use it. And the show kind of reflected that, because they would have what at the time would have been anachronistic things. I don't want to spoil too much, but imagine like a tank in the Old West. if you will. That kind of stuff.
There was a steampunky type feel to it.
Oh, very much so.
And I do agree, because during the series, Brisco would mention several times, well, it's the turn of the century, all this new stuff is getting ready to happen, and those of us that grew up through the 90s, that's how we were feeling too, because there was so much changing. Cable television was really taking off from over-the-air television. The new Fox television network started, in the 80s. And then, like you mentioned, the internet was getting going here in a few years after that. It was just an interesting time to experience. And Brisco would mention that it was 100 years removed, but he was capturing the feeling of what people felt in 1993 when he was talking about 1893.
It was an excellent way of exploring what people were going through at the time without actually talking about what we were going through at the time.
And it was a hopeful thing.
Yeah.
Because that's what I miss most about the 90s. And I'm not claiming the 90s were perfect, because there were problems we could talk about. But at the end of the day, the 90s, when I was living through it, I kept feeling life every day was going to get better and better. Not only for myself, but for society, for the world. Things just felt like every year that passed, things were getting better and better. Stuff that's made now is all post 9/11 stuff. And it's all deconstruction. And it's all depressing. And one thing we didn't mention here is, even though he has doubts about himself and how he measures up with his father, Brisco County Jr. is an actual hero. He's portrayed as such, wisecracking and all, and he's portrayed as a hero. And even Bowler, who I wouldn't necessarily call a hero, but when he works with Brisco, Brisco tends to show him a way to do things, and Bowler's character does change as the series goes on.
Yeah, because Bowler starts out as a very standoffish loner, and through the series he drops that guard and he welcomes people into his life, which was an interesting character arc to watch.
And I think we have to make sure to mention Billy Drago. He chewed up the scenery as an over-the-top villain. I mean, he must have enjoyed playing John Bly.
I think they must have had a ball on set. I wonder what that must have been like to be there in person with these guys in this show. It just, the consummate professionals that they were, and how they clicked so well on screen. And Billy Drago, he's always played very intense villains. I wonder what that must have been like in real life, what the actor must have been like.
You could tell he enjoyed playing this part, because he played it like an over-the-top James Bond type villain, where subtlety, no, he just took it up to a whole new level when he was doing it. It got more over the top as it went on. He was fairly reserved in the pilot, but it got more and more grandiose. And that's the thing, too, if you haven't seen this series, the John Bly character is not what he appears to be when you first see him. And I say that because this series takes some interesting paths with what it's telling with its science fiction element. That's the reason Mollie and I chose not to do a proper synopsis like we usually do when we review a pilot. Usually we review the pilot, we give a synopsis,
recap.
Recap of the story, and then we kind of give some indicators of where the story's going after that to kind of get people a feeling for why they want to continue with the series and give you some story elements that are coming up. But the fun of this series, if you haven't seen it, is not knowing where it's going, not knowing what that orb arc is, and not knowing what John Bly really is.
Yeah, because Billy Drago did an excellent job of portraying a very methodical psychopath. And yeah, when you find out what he really is at the end, yeah, I didn't see it coming. It was fantastic. It really was.
There is some humor here that it depends on your sense of humor. Like a lot of the jokes with Comet, the running gag is Brisco Jr. treats his horse like a human being, where he can understand what the horse is saying, and the horse gets hurt feelings and doesn't want to help Brisco. And so if you're okay with that humor, that can work for you. And there's a lot of what I call Bugs Bunny humor in this series. In fact, I can think of one scene in the pilot that is actually ripped right off the screen of a Coyote and Roadrunner cartoon. And it's funny. It's done well. It's funny. And they use that Bugs Bunny type humor throughout the series. And again, if you're okay shifting your brain in that mode, it works because they do it in a way where it's funny.
Yeah, I could see Pistol Pete as a kind of Wile E. Coyote. Definitely. Yeah, so there's a lot of the old Bugs Bunny Roadrunner cartoons. Definitely you can see an influence there. Just a really fun watch.
Dixie Cousins, the way she played her character, you called her that Mae West, and I agree with that. She also played her character over the top and kind of I don't want to necessarily call her a seductress, but she played up her feminine wiles through the series. And she did a really good job with that. It built, much like John Bly's character, it built past the pilot.
She used all of her assets.
She did.
I commend her for that.
And she played it very well. The thing I'm going to say about the pilot is, for me, because we rewatched the pilot before recording this, because it's been a while since we watched the series. And for me, the beginning of the pilot was paced pretty well. Then there's this part in the middle that drags, in my opinion. And then toward the end, the pacing picks up again. And it's that pacing at the end that the series starts adopting, and I think that's a good thing. And again, it kind of reminds me of the Orville, where I think the Orville struggled at first to try to get the pacing down, the mix of comedy and drama, but they figured it out as it went along, and I think this is a series like that. So if you watch the pilot, you're going to have that middle part of the pilot that's going to drag, but that's not indicative of the series, because each episode after this is like 45 minutes, and the pacing's usually pretty well done. In fact, that's the interesting thing, too, that you do see in the pilot, is they filmed this like old school serials, where you had different chapters of the episode, and they actually put the text on the screen of what chapter you were in, and usually the name of the chapter gave you an idea of what the next segment was going to be. Now, I didn't look to see if the chapters corresponded necessarily to the commercial breaks or not. I don't know if that's what they did, but it wouldn't surprise me if each chapter was a segment between commercial breaks. I'd have to look and see if that was the case or not. But if you're used to that sort of old school Flash Gordon or Buck Rogers serials where they had those chapters set up for you on the screen, they'd even put it on the screen, that's what this kind of did too. So there was a lot of throwback to that sort of storytelling. And Mollie mentioned this, Bruce Campbell, I'm sure most people listening to this video know him. There's a charisma to, I think, every part I've ever seen him in, even if it was a minor part. And he is the star of the show. That charisma comes through. He carries the show very well. And like I said, his character is balancing a lot of things in this series. He's got some issues with his dead father. He's got issues with trying to figure out what's happening with John Bly. He's got issues with keeping Lord Bowler in check. Because Lord Bowler, to me, the character, he kind of reminded me, we had a review of this a while back, but if you remember our review of Andromeda, the way Brisco would try to keep one step ahead of Bowler was kind of like how Captain Hunt would stay one step ahead of Tyr in Andromeda. And so there was a little bit of that going on there. It really was entertaining in true escapism in 2024, having something that occasionally is just ridiculous cartoon humor on the screen, but done on purpose. That is such a welcome break from what we're living through right now. So my recommendation for this series is, if you just want to get away from what's happening in the world for like 45 minutes at a time, this series will work for you as long as you're okay with some pushing the envelope humor at times. But I would say if you've watched the Orville and you've liked it, you'll probably like the humor that's in Brisco County Jr.
Has a little bit of Big Trouble in Little China.
Oh, yeah.
vibe to it,
In
too.
fact, one of the actors was in Big Trouble in Little China.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, it genuinely, I think, captured that early 90s feel. And, even if you just miss early 90s haircuts, there were a lot of people sporting those in this show. So, yeah, they weren't trying to be historically accurate at all. But it was still a really good time.
So I would recommend the purchase options that are out there for, like, getting it through rental Amazon, or I don't think it was rentals, purchase, right?
Yeah, it was all purchase.
Because we bought the DVD box set. It's going to be cheaper to do that.
Oh, and it's going to be an SD.
Yeah.
There's no HD version of this.
There is no Blu-ray for this, but I don't think it needs it. Although, if they ever made one, I would welcome it.
Yeah, but I think it adds something that it is in SD. I think it adds to that feel of the time period.
But I would recommend buying the box set, and that's going to be much cheaper than buying it per episode. Or, like Mollie mentioned, go to your library, see if they have it. You might even look on YouTube, because sometimes some series people upload full episodes. So somebody might have uploaded the full episodes.
Yeah, because sometimes they just don't care. I mean,
because they're
YouTube.
so old of a property.
Yeah.
They're like, well, who cares? This is from 1993.
However, in this case, YouTube is actually selling episodes of this, so who knows?
So, unfortunately, I wish that this was on a service that you could, like a Netflix or an Amazon Prime or an HBO Max, but unfortunately, it's not on any of those services. I think it used to be on the Roku channel, but I don't know if it's still on there anymore.
It's not. I checked. I checked. No, but as I said, you can find used DVDs of this for $8 on eBay. So, $8 for a 26 episode season. That's not bad.
Agreed.
You just have to dig out a DVD player somewhere. Well, although Blu-ray players will play it too. But yeah, hey, if you have one, go ahead and get the discs.
And I know our audience tends to be science fiction fans. And what we're saying is, beyond steampunk, there is a pretty heavy science fiction element to this. But we can't really tell you the pieces that are there because we'll ruin the series for you by doing that. So you'll just have to trust us that if you watch this series, yes, you'll get the Professor Wickwire steampunk stuff, but there's another element of science fiction here that has to do with the Oars and John Bly, and you're just going to have to take our word for it that this does turn into a science fiction story until they resolve this thread at like episode 20.
Yep, episodes 1 through 20 deal with the orb. And then after that, they just turn it into straight Western.
So definitely recommend it. It's got some pieces to it that, depending on your sense of humor, you might say that's garbage, or you might say that's great. So can't really say, oh my gosh, you're going to love this thing from start to end. It really depends on the individual. But I do think there's enough in here that the pieces that don't work for you will be offset by the pieces that will work for you.
Yeah, if you like Bruce Campbell, this is Bruce Campbell in a sci-fi Western. How could you go wrong,
And consider it just a one and done. Think of this as just kind of a limited time miniseries of 20 episodes. And if you go with that mindset, I think there's a lot here to enjoy.
Agreed. So, yep, there's our review for The Adventures of Brisco County Jr. 2 thumbs up from us. So, if you need something to watch that will be uplifting and take you out of right now into a time that was more hopeful and just better, yeah, The Adventures of Brisco County Jr. I saw some of the DVDs on eBay for $8, or get it for free someplace, like your local library. And until next time,
take care.
My God, he touched Pete's piece.
Nobody touches Pete's piece.